Hello, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. It is I, Emily Sophia, aka Mighty Sophia, here to break down for you guys the latest episode of Better Call Saul. We are on the episode, season 3, episode 2, Witness. So, spoiler alert before I dive into the mad thick of things, as I shall be endeavoring to bear all in this review. I'm going to do my best to walk you through all of the events of the episode and intertwine my analyses throughout. I also thank you guys for your patience in me getting up these reviews because I have been watching simultaneously Bates Motel and this show. And it's important that I dedicate as much time as I can to both. So next week's review is probably going to be up later on Tuesday. So be forewarned. But anyways, so this episode, let's talk. This is the story of not the unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt, but the breakable Jimmy McGill, a future fraudster whose wiliness and guile is surpassed only by his sense of familial loyalty. And that is a weakness that Chuck abuses to successfully castigate and vilify his own flesh and blood, whose gains in life Chuck sees as ill-deserved, and whose sins he sees as deserving of the harshest punishment. He is his brother's keeper and his Achilles heel. He referring to Chuck and his relationship to Jimmy. He's a wolf in sheep's space. He is a wolf in a sheep's space blanket. That is the stupid joke I just tripped all over. And his ruthlessness knows no freaking bounds, this guy. And it turns out that Ernesto hearing the tape was actually a part of Chuck's elaborate master plan, so I didn't even see that coming. And Chuck embodies all the characteristics of a deeply compelling and downright despicable villain, one who actually fancies himself as a steward of justice and moral integrity. And on that point, I'd like to quote the brother I happen to side with in this uncivil war, which is asshole. So now my question is, will Kim or Mike intervene as Jimmy fights what feels like at this point a losing battle against his turncoat kin? You gotta wonder, because Kim was actually going to try and represent him in this matter, but as we see in the preview for next week, it looks like he's going to try and take that onto his shoulders. So Gus is the tie that binds Mike and Jimmy together and will inevitably play a role in Jimmy's descent to the criminal underworld. And Chuck, of course, takes the biggest slice of the culpability cake for ushering Jimmy towards shadier shores, believing that Jimmy is actually already beyond redemption, which I think is so far from the truth. So he's effectively buried his brother alive when you think about it. He built the coffin himself, and now he is hammering in each nail. He's pretty satisfied with his role as judge, jury, and executioner, I can tell you that much. But yeah, so we open up the episode on a boiling kettle, which clearly represents the escalation of the situation and soon-to-be fulfillment of Chuck's scheme. And he fixes himself some tea and whistles a lively tune as he tests every lock in the house, and he peeks out the windows, peers out the peephole on the front door, and the camera sits in the corner of the room in this really cool shot, and it slowly pans until we see a stranger in the mirror on the right side of the frame, and it's private security, something like that, and the two have a polite, albeit very clandestine, exchange, and then cut the lights. And Chuck can't help himself as he looks outside one more time. He's working in darkness, not trusting his brother, whom he constantly frames as an agent of the devil, but in fact, unlike Chuck, he's kind of making a difference in the world and kind of sort of mostly doing right by his adoring geriatric clientele. Jimmy's got problems, yes, but this guy, if he thinks he's got the moral high ground, then he has another thing coming. He is the one working in darkness. Let it be known. And it's quite ironic considering that later when when Jimmy comes tearing in, it's in broad daylight, you know? So Chuck definitely miscalculates in that situation. And then we finally see the guys who bugged Mike's car, and Mike is able to trail his target to this highway overpass with a drop box and kind of this power substation, and then ultimately, of course, to Los Pollos Hermanos, which is kind of a big deal on every possible level for the Breaking Bad universe. We also get this, at one point, this super, super wide shot, which represents the vantage point from which Mike is stalking the stalker. And the distance is so vast, like, it's crazy. Like, the foreground looks miniaturized, like it's a reconstruction, not actual footage of a real world location. I am just dazzled by the technology that was used there. But then comes sunup, Mike hasn't wavered in his chase. 7:30 in the morning, and surely enough, he is right around the corner from Los Pollos Hermanos as the camera slowly reveals, as if with a knowing wink and a nod. So Jimmy's paralegal interviewee, Francesca Liddy from the DMV, spies a crooked spot on his mural, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Now, I completely forgot about this. But Francesca is indeed one of our first alumna from Breaking Bad. She is Jimmy's secretary at the future offices of Saul Goodman and Associates. So sadly, her fate is very much tied to that of Slip and Jimmy's. She walks away from the red tape bureaucracy and the benefits, basically a lamb shepherded to the slaughter of Jimmy's sleazy enterprise to come. Mind you, my guess is that she's not exactly a hapless victim, but one way or another, she comes into Jimmy's employ further down the line after what's sure to be the explosive dissolution of Kim and Jimmy's fledgling firm, which I'm not looking forward to seeing that come to a head. So and then we see that he and Kim have drastically different interview approaches, and what he says is perfection is the enemy of perfectly adequate. So Jimmy is desperate to get this woman hired, as he's expecting an avalanche of calls after his new advertisement airs. And Jimmy decides to, apologies for the garage door, coach Francesca on being folksy and dropping the strategic Cracker Barrel reference to win the old folks over. And he starts rearranging the furniture as Francesca locks down an appointment with dog-owning Dorothy. But her second call is a taller order than most. Happens to be Mr. Ehrmantraut, who really doesn't want to talk about Cracker Barrel. Surprise, surprise there. So Mike ends up sending Jimmy in to Los Pollos Hermanos to spy on Mr. Green Chevy Blazer and his knapsack of secrecy. Now remember when Walt put a tracking device on Gus's car on Hank's behalf and followed it to the restaurant? Gotta say, parallels abound for the vigilant viewer, that's for sure. And now I'm at the point where I'm trying to pay more attention to them than ever before. But yeah, so we get to hear their dialogue about the mission as the camera moves a full 360 degrees and circles back to Jimmy in the doorway. He picks up a Pollo's Classic and coffee for his covert operation, which really, really, really is not. Ketchup for his order, no salsa. Much less extra salsa. And then we see the Jimmy kind of peering around, scanning the perimeter, and he sees the car pull up outside, and in walks Mike's man. And he happens to want the extra salsa, so clearly this guy knows what's up. Jimmy's definitely, in this situation, he is not one for subtlety, and he makes a whole show of dolling up his Java nearby, and he's still in focus as the camera sits over the blurred shoulder of Mr. Green Chevy Blazer. And he sips on his oversweet drink as his eyes are locked on the duffel bag. And that, of course, is when Gustavo Fring cuts a rug in the background, playing the part of the dutiful manager. And for anyone who hasn't seen Breaking Bad, like, you see this guy in the background and you don't think anything of it, but his shape is so immediately recognizable to fans of the previous show. And he's bussing his way around the dining area, but passes the other guy's table completely, which remains the fulcrum of Jimmy's focus. And he jets not long after, which gives Jimmy very little to go on and report back to Mike. And it's a demanding affair for Jimmy. It's this sensory onslaught, and we follow his feverish eye for detail throughout his whole dine-in reconnaissance. But before seeing himself out, Jimmy not so casually goes dumpster diving and strategically releases his watch clasp, realizing that otherwise he's going to come up empty-handed, and the whole thing is going to look a tad bit awkward. So he knows how to save himself in a pinch. But Gus, of course, isn't afraid to do the dirty work on behalf of his valued customer, soon-to-be underworld liaison, and fishes out the runaway timepiece. So we get that fun little exchange between characters whose futures are going to be inextricably tied in the days to come. So Jimmy reports back to Mike, and he is all too eager to join Mike for the full adventure, the flamboyant Robin to his James Bond, I guess. And Mike is pretty hard-pressed to pass up that offer, as alluring as it is. And Jimmy leaves, but not before reminding Mike that he's got his back, and he should never forget it. So Gus is still making the rounds, but we do finally catch this flicker of a change of countenance, just a little glimpse of the powerful kingpin that we know the seemingly hospitable restaurateur to be. So now Mike has a new target who careens in and out of the parking lot, and the man in the black SUV just so happens to be another ill-fated character. This guy is actually Victor, who is the future sufferer of the grotesque box cutter death that people friggin' talked up just about as much as the Red Wedding from Game of Thrones when I was still catching up on his show. But we see that his trachea is still intact for now. But Francesca, she hasn't quit yet. She's still rolling with the punches, and that's going to define pretty much the rest of her professional life. The offices hop in, and we actually see this momentary grin steal across Kim's face, and you got to savor those precious moments. You really do, because knowing where things are headed, it's important to come up for air once in a while. But that's when Ernesto pays Kim an emergency visit, and the poor guy is a nervous wreck. He is Chuck's perfect lure in this situation. So before Ernie lets Kim in on Chuck's dirty little secret, we cut back to Circus Master Jimmy, who is just running the show like a pro. But when Kim bursts back into the office, she immediately gets herself hired as Jimmy's attorney. And she pulls out the put a dollar in my pocket line, just like Saul says to Jesse and Walt in the old Breaking Bad episode, which is actually the one entitled Better Call Saul. So there you have it. It's a fun little throwback there. And then Jimmy at this point tells all, and he says he was broken. He was a broken man. I couldn't leave him in Crazy Town like that. But that is, of course, when the whole space blanket wraps tape recorder surfaces. And Jimmy is absolutely floored. He's stupefied, drooping like this crestfallen puppy. Like, he taped me of all the things, of all the moves that he could play on this chessboard of their lives. That one? Really? So the two, they're sitting on opposite sides of the room in the frame, and we can feel the distance between them as Kim immediately leaps into action even before Jimmy can speak, which is a rare but fitting silence on his part. And she says she'll do the research, look into it, and sort it out. And yep, sure they will. But Jimmy's just still so stunned and grieved, and he just gets back to work so he can cope. The show must go on for now. And the tape will come off later, the kind you can peel from a wall and the kind you use to put your brother behind bars, like the loving sibling and upright citizen that you are. So Jimmy says goodbye to his last customer, and Francesca commends him for a solid day's work. It's clear that his clients adore him. He must be doing something right. And who doesn't, comes the derisive reply from Jimmy. So as Kim comes to him and she's working on a legal angle, namely trying to find a way to mitigate the admission of guilt, claiming that Jimmy said whatever would be necessary to bring Chuck back from his edge, Jimmy's completely silent during this entire thing, and he is carefully, slowly rolling the tape off the walls, just as meticulously as Chuck taught him when he was helping dismantle the space cave in the previous episode, which is just so freaking sad. This is the least on top of his game that we've ever seen him, at least in recent memory. And he finally unveils the new Wexler McGill logo. And Kim is so sweet and just sincerely assures him that it does not look like a stock market crash, though we are clued into a foreshadowing that shows that these two lovebird lawyers are they are not privy to, so that's really kind of worrisome there. But he promises that he's okay when Kim presses to know how he's actually feeling. It's one last deception before the gloves come off, and Jimmy starts pushing harder and harder on the tape as he rolls it down, and then he just furiously rips it off like a Band-Aid, tearing the paint in this aggressive act that basically illustrates the emotional wounds that Chuck has inflicted on him, you know. So Mike Hunt ends up taking him back into the sprawling desert, and we see the sun is on the descent, and he comes across a ringing phone sitting atop the gas cap. And that is when he answers. And guess who? Yeah, that's another of my terrible jokes. I am too sleep deprived. Like, I write this stuff down and then I'm just like, oh, goodness gracious, what am I actually doing? But yeah, obviously, we know that this is all coming back to Gus. His introduction in this episode is far from unintentional or coincidental, rather. Yeah, but I'm super excited to see where this goes and to see the line of work that Mike ultimately enters. So meanwhile, we cut back to things at the residence of Chuck McGill. Howard is running across these yards to make it to Chuck's. We're like, what is he actually doing? Is he breaking and entering? And then it becomes clear as soon as he arrives at the house that he was forced by Chuck's orders to park several blocks away to avoid scrutiny, you know. And then Dave, who's the private investigator, security detail guy, he leaves the 2B. Now, Howard's concerned about the cost of the private investigators, which I assume are on the firm's tab. And he recommends that, you know, maybe they open their minds to a slightly different approach, like nighttime investigations only, right? You know? And he expects that, Chuck expects that Jimmy is going to come steal the tape under cover of darkness. He says, I know my brother, and speak of the devil, that is exactly when Jimmy shows up, literally breaking down the door, the one-man hurricane of Family Scorned, and he is just hurling expletives, and Chuck, he seems to wear this face of false shock, or maybe it is genuine to some extent, but the outcome works way too well in his favor for me to believe that he feels any contrition or fear in that moment. And Jimmy lays into Chuck. It's like, no wonder Rebecca left you. What took her so long? So we finally get a little insight into what happened with that relationship, which I'm sure many of us were curious about. And again, the irony of the fact that Jimmy comes by day cannot be overlooked. You know, guess who the real agent of darkness is? Seriously, it's been Chuck the entire time. So Howard and Dave decide to hide as Jimmy violently destroys the tape and inculpates himself further and further. And now Chuck has the crime and its witnesses. Even if the material evidence has been destroyed, he is paying for it. Jimmy is paying for his sins in precisely the way that Chuck intended, and his scheme has come to marvelous fruition. And I had to watch that scene back a couple of times, actually, because I was just so stunned at how horrific that was, and And Chuck, he's completely smothered in darkness with the lighting of the room as Jimmy comes to grips with betrayal, Judge, jury, executioner, Judas, and Cain. Chuck's rap sheet is growing by the minute. And sadly, of course, Kim's buck stops there, and it's off to the slammer for Slippin' Jimmy, who intends to represent himself, according to next week's teaser. So that is the cliffhanger edge that we are left suspended from for the rest of the week. This episode, of course, on many levels felt more like Breaking Bad than ever before, due in no small part to the return of even smaller figures like Francesca. It's so cool, just the intricate attention to detail that the show has, and its faithfulness to fleshing out this universe, and in meaningful ways as well. They're not stumbling over themselves to try to get these killer cameos to boost the show's ratings. There is just such a cool confidence in everything that Peter Gould and Vince Gilligan and his team have wrought, and I think that is part of what adds to the show's appeal and what makes it so special. It is this beautiful homage to the series that came before, but it's a completely independent and autonomous story that stands on its own, and I think deserves to be trolled deserves to be told regardless of how awry everything goes. And there are still some big questions that we have. What with knowing Jimmy's future as Saul Goodman, putting all of that aside, the big questions remain: what is going to happen to Chuck and Kim? And how is what happens to them going to play in Jimmy's decisions to go in the direction of Saul Goodman and to craft his future the way that he does? And these are things that the show in loving, intricate detail plays out for all of us. And it's just such an immense pleasure to see storytelling of this caliber, and I'm enjoying it so much already. So I hope you guys enjoyed this review. If there's any Easter eggs, Breaking Bad stuff, plot points, ideas, things that you want to get out there that I didn't actually touch on, please bring those things up in the comments below. This video is just the beginning of the conversation, okay? So you guys take care of yourselves, please, and as always, I will be back before you know it.